You know what the scariest thing about world building is? It's that each choice that you make has potential to completely break your story. And if your story is part of a wider universe, then it can completely break the entire universe. And by that, I mean it makes the world that your story exists within make no sense. It fills it with plot holes. So let's talk about some things to be wary about when creating your own narrative worlds, whether it be comics, video games, movies, books, or any other narrative form. So first of all, let's talk about the world map. So our world, the Earth, and the way that it is, the shape of it, the way that countries are laid out and city locations and things like that, they're all the results of certain factors, often geographical. Now, writers, especially us fantasy and sci-fi writers, we love putting stuff in really cool places. We love structures atop waterfalls, we love temples floating in the sky, and so on. But those things might not make sense within our world geographically, chronologically, culturally, or in terms of trade and commerce. So, say for example, you've got a river and you went to run here and it's going to feature prominently within your story, or maybe it won't feature prominently. Maybe it will just be a little mark on the map. Either way, you need to think carefully about the source, whether it be a spring or a mountain or something like that. Will it run to a lake or to the sea? Will it produce marshland? Will it have valleys? Will the capitals be somewhere on the river? Will it be on the estuary? Will it be further up? You need to decide these things. You can't just draw a wiggly line on the map and hope for the best. Also, the types of cities that pop up around this river and their industries and the trade routes should directly tie to the river and, to some degree, have impact upon your story. If you actually look at the world that we live in and delve deeply into this, you'll see that it gets a whole lot more interesting. The way that geography can impact on the way that your world works and the world works. There's loads of interesting videos, especially about the Mississippi and how it helped the US become the world superpower that it is. So never underestimate the power of geography and pay proper attention when you're building your world map. The second thing that I'm scared of is power systems and scaling. And this one is so scary because it can actually make your story laughable if you're not careful. If you have power systems, miracles, or magic, or whatever you want to call it in your stories, it can get messy if you don't set rules very, very early on. And if you don't stick to the rules. So if you make your characters too strong too early, or you make an ability too broad in the scope of what it can do, then your story could potentially fall apart because there is no problem that can come up that, that skill, ability, or power cannot solve straight away. It's for reasons like this that there's ability points and mana points and skill trees and stuff like that within video games. They exist to hold you, the character, the audience, the person that's playing or taking part in the story back. It holds you from just steamrolling right through the narrative. Because narratives fall apart, they have no attractiveness if there's no struggle, if there's no fear of losing, no risk. It just basically takes all the stakes out. If that becomes the case, then there is no story to be told. And technology can be similar with this, but it's a little bit easier to control because there's loads of factors that you can put in that can make technology work in certain ways, which you can't necessarily do with magic or mana or power or miracles. The third part of world building that's scary is timeline and chronology. Now, I struggle a lot with timeline, writing anyone's age or any distance of time where something starts and something ends. And I especially struggle with it when things overlap, which is actually quite funny because I have the ages of my characters written over a lot of the materials, like my website and stuff like that. And I also have a lot of stories which overlap chronologically. And it stresses me to no end because if I get anything with the timeline wrong, it can really mess up the universe in the way that it's understood. So, for example, with my main comic series Arc Song, there's a global conflict that had just finished just before the story started. In my web novel Enkarai, which takes place or starts just before Arc Song, that conflict is still going on. Even though it overlaps with Arc Song and the conflict ends within Enkarai, it means that I need to make sure that events that happen work timeline wise. Otherwise, the entire story falls out of sync, and therefore the universe as a whole falls out of sync. Now, the way that I try to make these things work is I try to look at real world events, look at how long they last. So things like a global conflict. Our last two global conflicts, the First World Wars, the First and Second World Wars, I should say, last a certain amount of time. and they involve a certain amount of countries. So I look at that sort of stuff and try to do a similar sort of thing with my stories to keep things running for a realistic length and to keep the story scopes where they should be. And that's an effective thing to do for most things with, characters' ages, with how long it takes for certain things to be built, and so on. Just look at the real world. It will help you so much. But it's still a very scary a part of world building. Another scary thing that sort of links in with timeline and the chronological order of things is time travel. If you dip into this, you're playing with fire. There's a million ways to approach time travel, but it almost always creates a bunch of plot holes, and your audience will have a field day with those plot holes. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't touch time travel. Time travel is a very effective, tool in stories, but it's the angle that you take it from, and how far you want to dip in, how technical you want to get with it, how hard you want to make the science in that. Two recent stories that I've read that do it really well, do some really cool stuff with time travel are This Is How You Lose the Time War and Sea of Tranquility. Those two stories did a really, really, really good job of playing around with time travel and the way that it works. Now, I will make more videos about time travel, the timeline, and how that affects world building. But for now, just be wary of it when you're building your stories because it is a very, very scary thing to mess with, and it can have a massive impact on your world. Now, the fourth thing I'm scared of in world building is religion. So building religions is really tough, and a little bit nerve-wracking because they don't just pop up out of nowhere. They don't form in isolation. Often religions overlap and they come from years and years and years of historical and cultural influence. It's really interesting seeing, even in the world that we live in, how different religions have overlapped and interlinked and borrowed things from each other or grown out of each other. Of course, we have the Abrahamic religions, we have the Greek, Roman, and Egyptian religions, which trade a lot. We have Sikhism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, which have slight overlaps, and loads of other examples of this across the world. So understanding that there's a lot more to religion than just, oh, there's a belief and people do these rituals and that's that. It's very, very important. It's very important in considering how you build your world around that and the impacts that that has on the world, the story, the characters, and so on. You need to make sure that your characters, the people in the background, that they're all acting to some degree in accordance with the religions of the day or the lack of religion of the day. You also need to decide whether the thing that the religions within your story, within this world that you're building, whether the things that they worship actually have a direct impact on the world, whether it's been evidenced in the past or presently, and how that plays in. You also need to be aware of how you draw on aspects of modern day religions so as not to offend others, because we have to draw on something. This actually brings us to our next and final world building fear. And so our fifth scary thing about world building is causing offense. Now, it's very, very easy to offend people with the way that you build your world. And there's so much nuance to creating worlds in a way which does not build offense. Because the problem is we have to draw on what we know. We have to draw on the world around us to make these worlds. We can't just plop it out of nowhere. We can only work with what we've got. And so we have to accept that there is the potential for us to cause offense to people with what we do. So we need to work to minimize that. So you have to think carefully about things like, how you're going to name characters, how you're going to name places. Are people going to dress in a certain way? What will people dressed in a certain way do? You have to think about the appearance of characters and how they interact with the rest of the group. And with characters that look a certain way, where there's a trend in how those characters who look that way are behaving and treating others. We also need to be aware of, current events and things that are going on now, and whether that mirrors certain things within our books and stories and video games and so on, and whether it starts going into the area of metaphor and allegory without us realizing, and if it can be received or perceived in a certain way. We need to watch out for that and be wary of that, and it's a very scary thing to commit to certain designs and to draw influence from certain places, but it has to be done. It just has to be done really well, and that's the tough part. I think one of the main things that we can do to avoid offense in this area is to think carefully about the audience that the story is intended for, and also the audience that it will reach. So even if you intend it for a certain audience who may not necessarily take offense, be aware that it might reach beyond this audience and how that might be perceived. Try not to offend people with our world building is very, very, very scary stuff, but something that you do need to take into account and that you do need to try to minimize. So that's it. 5 things that scare me about world building. Now, I'll be digging into these a bit more in the future individually, as I've said, but hopefully some of the things that I've mentioned have got you thinking about, how you're going to construct your world, or how you have constructed your world already, and what adjustments that you can make before you release that final product. Now, that's all we have time for today. Feel free to check out any of our other videos, but I will see you in another video. So keep working until next time.